Hi, welcome to Chapter 7. Today we'll talk about the muscular system. So I do have a table here. It asks for the characteristics of three types of muscles in the body and where each is found. So you'll want to look at that table just to see what it looks like. Maybe I'll draw it in just a second. So let's take a look at the three different types of muscles. Okay, I'm going to bring that up right now. And there they are. Let's go ahead. All right, so there are three types of muscles: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow organs, and this type of muscle is involuntary. What that means is that you don't have control over it, right? When your body needs for it to contract, it will contract. For example, we find it in digestive, urinary, reproductive structures, blood vessels, the walls of blood vessels. All right, so think of any time you need to move something along or regulate the movement of something along, a passageway. So the digestive system, right? There's smooth muscles in the walls. And so when there's food in there, when you need to move things along, those muscles will contract and squeeze it along. Okay. Urinary, the same, right? When you need to expel the urine, your urinary bladder is too full, the urinary bladder contracts, as well as some of the transport tubes and things like that are going to contract and move the urine out. Reproductive, also, we'll talk about that way later, but like the female uterus, when it's time to give birth, that is just a giant uh, organ of smooth muscle. And so when it's time to give birth under the proper conditions, under the influence of hormones, it's going to cause that muscles or those muscles to contract, and it will squeeze babies out. It will move sperm along, right, for like an ejaculation or something like that. So blood vessels also allows us to control blood flow to different areas, right? You think, when you're embarrassed or something, blood flow increases. The smooth muscle and the blood vessels relax. Maybe your face gets red as a result, or if there's an area that needs healing, okay, you're going to relax the muscle or in the blood vessels going to those areas and cause more blood to go in those areas. And by the same token, you can constrict those muscles and restrict blood flow to certain areas. Okay, so this is all involuntary. Luckily, we don't have to think about, moving food along or, expelling our urine. It's just going to happen. There's a few other things, non-striated uninucleate. I will draw some pictures. Cardiac muscle is a different type of muscle. It's all contractile, meaning, the muscles um, decrease its length and therefore shorten, and that is muscle contraction. But there's different characteristics. So this is found in the heart. Okay, the heart is just a giant muscle, but it's different from smooth muscle. It's different from skeletal muscle, which is what we're going to get to next. All right. It also is involuntary. Thank goodness. We don't have to tell our heart to contract and squeeze blood through it all the time, right? It does it on its own. It has it's striated. And I didn't address this here in the smooth muscle being non-striated, but striated means striped. There's a pattern that when you look at it, it's a stripe pattern. Whereas the smooth muscle does not have this stripe pattern. Okay, cardiac muscle cells are branched, uninucleate. Uni means one, nucleate means nucleus. So in smooth muscle, each cell has a single nucleus. Whereas in cardiac muscle, each cell also has one nucleus. In the skeletal muscle, it's a little different. Cardiac muscle has what we call gap junctions and desmosomes. We talked a little bit about that in tissues, right? These are connections between cells. And so the gap junction has a passageway from between cells and allows materials to pass quickly across. We'll talk a little bit about maybe not specifically gap junctions, but how cardiac muscle cells need to be connected, electrically connected. So information passes from one cell to another very rapidly. And then desmosomes are found, there's the little spot welds or the buttons kind of between cells, and they're found in cells that move a lot. Okay, and it just holds the cells together. The last one is skeletal muscles, and these are voluntary and attached to the skeleton, right? So it allows for movement. We walk, we talk, we raise our hands. These are all things that we control. It's voluntary, and attached to muscles are attached to bones, which when the muscles shorten, it causes the bones to move. Striated or striped and multinucleate. Oh, that's kind of weird. It has more than one nucleus. All right, so let's go ahead and take a peek. I'm going to draw a picture. You can just look at your textbook, right? Or you could draw a picture next to each one. So let's start with the smooth muscle. So this is chapter 7, muscles. All right, and we're doing number 13. So smooth muscle. It's actually kind of spindle shaped like this. The muscle cells look like this. Uninucleate. Okay. We have cardiac muscle. Okay, these are also uninucleate, but they're branched fibers. Get a little close. Okay, so if I were to draw some cells, single nucleus. Okay. But they have a striped appearance. Whoops, I'm going to do it this way. Okay, there's a stripe pattern to it. There's desmosomes, right, between the cells, and which connect them to the other cells, as well as gap junctions between them. Okay, there's specialized names for these. They're called intercalated discs. These structures that are kind of between the cardiac muscle cells. The third one, skeletal muscles. Now, this is what we're going to spend most of our time on, the anatomy of the skeletal muscle and the physiology also of skeletal muscle. All right, so let's go back and then fill out more of our, okay, and go to this. So now we're going to spend our time on skeletal muscles. It should say name the 3 skeletal muscle coverings. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it here, but now we're going to focus on the skeletal muscle. Okay, so there are 3 coverings, and it will make more sense because we'll draw it and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. And then it says, what do they cover? So this is where like medical terminology comes in handy, understanding the roots of the words, understanding the Latin and Greek origins of these words. So epimysium, myo refers to muscle. Epi means above or on top of, right? So you might want to kind of think of going to the grocery store and go over by the meat department and look at the cuts of meat. So the meat that you're looking at is skeletal muscle. And so they're going to have these connective tissue coverings around and through the muscle. And you know, if you're a carnivore, right, and you eat steak or something, you know that there's these structures, connective tissue, kind of around the muscle as well as within it, right? It's kind of the tough stuff around and within the muscle, the steak, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about these connective tissue coverings. The first one on the outside is called the epimysium. Okay, it surrounds the entire muscle. It's got a lot of like collagen fibers, so it's pretty tough and you know, a lot of connective tissue. All right, peri means around, and myo means muscles. So perimysium, it surrounds another structure called the fascicle. Now, these are a little more internal, but still it surrounds these large structures called fascicles. Maybe think of that steak, how it's partitioned into sections. Each one of those sections is called a fascicle, and it is surrounded by its own connective tissue covering called the perimysium. Endo means within. Myo is muscles. So within the muscle, there's another connective tissue covering called the endomysium. Okay, this surrounds what we call muscle fibers. So we're getting smaller and smaller structures within the muscle, and each one has a little connective tissue covering. All right, and then it says what structures, well, what type of tissue? It's all connective tissue. And what do they cover? And I mentioned here, what are the structures that they cover? The next question, diagram the structure of a muscle. I'm actually going to draw this because it's more fun to draw. And again, drawing is a very important part of learning, especially in anatomy. There's something that happens when you draw. So resist just looking at it. Resist just copying the picture and putting it in your you know, your study guide here. And you can do that certainly, because I provide you with those images. But in addition to that, do the drawing with me. Okay. It's very valuable. So what I'll do first is I'll draw it first, and then I'm going to put the image. But before I put the image, I want to draw it. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to share my. Okay, so let's draw the skeletal muscle and let's look at the anatomy. And we are going to draw what we call the macroscopic view, or the kind of the gross anatomy, the things that we can see with our eyes, and then we'll go to a microscopic anatomy. Okay, so question number 15 is really the macroscopic or the gross anatomy. All right, so we're first going to draw the bone, because as I mentioned, skeletal muscles are attached to the bone. Now, it can be any bone and it can be any muscle, and we will later get into specific types of muscles that you're going to learn, to be able to name the different muscles in the body. But right now we're looking at just kind of a general muscle. Okay. And so this is a bone. Okay. And the bone has a muscle attached. So I'm going to just kind of draw the tendon. All right. So this is connective tissue attaching the muscle to the bone. So here's the bone. And then this is connective tissue called the tendon that connects the bone, the muscle to the bone. Right. Now, because a tendon is connective tissue, it is continuous with the first covering called the epimysium, right? So even though, we call it something different, it's all continuous. Connective tissue is just kind of continuous. It's actually, this tendon is continuous with the periosteum, the covering, connective tissue covering of the bone. All right. And so because it's all like collagen fibers, it's all connected. And that's why muscles don't just rip off the bone really easily. You think of like professional athletes, the way they move, um, think of like soccer players or basketball players that kind of make sharp movements. They're putting a lot of stress on these tendons. And why don't they pull off? Sure, they do pull off sometimes, but it's not real common. Okay. And it's because all these fibers, collagen fibers, are all connected. And so think of it as kind of a continuous thing, but depending on where it is, we'll call it different structures. So when it is surrounding the entire muscle, okay, we call it an epimysium. So epi again means on top or above. So I'm going to draw the connective tissue coverings here. Okay, epimysium. And this whole structure is called, well, I call it the whole muscle. Okay, so over here on this side, I'm going to just kind of label the structure. This is the whole muscle. And I want you to be able to distinguish between the two. On this side, we're talking about what is the structure of the muscle. Okay, it's the whole muscle. This side is the connective tissue covering that covers these structures, all right? So connective tissue coverings. All right, so is that clear? We're talking about two different things, the connective tissue covering around it like this. And then over here, we're talking about the entire structure. All right, so you remember I mentioned that muscles are composed of different units within it. It's partitioned off into different structures. And I'm going to pull out one of those structures like this. Okay. And again, if you go over to the meat department, you look at it, the whole muscle is divided up into little structures. Each one of these structures is called a fascicle. Okay. So this is the structure. Each one of these is a different fascicle. But there's a connective tissue covering around the fascicle, or each one of these fascicles, okay? So each one of these fascicles is surrounded by connective tissue covering like this. More connective tissue. This covering is the perimysium. All right, now the perimysium, again, surrounds the fascicle. But wait, there's more. So inside each fascicle, it's further subdivided up into different little sections. Okay. And if I pull out one of these sections here, okay, each one of these sections is called a muscle fiber, or sometimes referred to as a muscle cell. Okay. Now, this too is surrounded by a connective tissue covering. All right, around each one of these muscle fibers. The covering is called the endomysium. The endomysium surrounds the muscle fiber. But wait, there's more. So within each muscle fiber, we have small little structures. I'll pull one out here. This is called a myofibril. And we'll stop there. Okay, so this is called the myofibril. It doesn't have a connective tissue covering, and we will go ahead and draw the microscopic view of this. All right, so I hope that's clear. We're talking about skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones or the skeleton by way of connective tissue, a tendon. which is dense, regular connective tissue, right? The tendon then is continuous with the first of the connective tissue coverings, which is the epimysium. Okay, the epimysium here, it surrounds the structure, the whole muscle. The whole muscle is made up of small units called fascicles, and each fascicle is surrounded by another connective tissue covering, the perimysium. Each fascicle is made up of smaller subunits called muscle fibers or cells, and each muscle fiber is surrounded by connective tissue covering called the endomysium. All right, and then within each muscle fiber, we have smaller units called myofibrils. All right, and now we're going to take a look at the, well, actually, let's go back. And okay, oops, wrong one. Sorry, I've got different things open. Okay, so let's take a look now. Diagram the structure of a muscle. So I'm going to give you the one that's in the images in your textbook. All right. So here we have the bone, we have the tendon, we have the whole muscle, we have the fascicles. Each fascicle has a muscle fiber or cell, and within each muscle fiber cell, we have a myofibril. And then we're going to get to this microscopic view. All right, so this is a myofibril. All right, so now let's take a look at kind of the microscopic view. And that's the next question. What is the basic functional unit of a skeletal muscle? In other words, what is its like components on the inside? Okay, and what do we consider? It's called the functional unit. I'll put it here, and then we'll go ahead and draw some more. So the basic functional unit of a skeletal muscle is called the sarcomere. And we're going to go ahead and draw that. Okay. So let's go ahead and go back to our drawing. All right, so let's go. All right, so now let's take a look. What we're going to do is we're going to look at kind of this area here. And so the thing is that each section looks like the previous section. So just keep in mind, we're looking at very small things, and we're going to look at the microscopic view. Okay, so I'm going to draw a muscle fiber and a myofibril. Okay, so let's take a look at a muscle fibers first. And I'm going to draw it bigger. So this is the muscle fiber. And remember, the muscle fiber is surrounded by the endomysium. I'm going to look at what color I used. So the endomysium surrounds the muscle fiber. Now, the muscle fiber, remember I use the term muscle cell because it is the cell of the skeletal muscle. And so I'm going to draw, because it is a cell, this outer layer here is the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Okay, and then it's surrounded by the endomysium. All right, so connective tissue around it, like this. Now, remember in our description of skeletal muscle, I mentioned that it's multinucleate. So within the cell, instead of one nucleus, we have multiple nuclei in it. And the reason being that during development, as your muscles are developing, okay, as an an embryo and as a fetus, we get these long fibers because myocytes individual muscle cells actually fuse together to form these long fibers. And so it's these fibers are made up of multiple cells that have fused together. So that's why we'll have more than one nucleus, in a muscle fiber, or sometimes we call it a muscle cell, but it's actually many cells together. All right. Now, remember that the muscle fiber is made up of these individual myofibrils. Okay. And so we have a bunch of myofibrils in here. Okay. And remember, surrounded by the endomysium, just connective tissue surrounding it. Okay. Now, within the myofibril, so this is the myofibril, it is divided into sections. Each one of these sections is called a sarcomere. Sarco also refers to muscle. All right. So these sarcomeres are repeated over and over and over again in these myofibrils. So we're going to look at an individual sarcomere to see what is it made up of. Okay, because we're getting down to the microscopic, right? The cellular level. So the sarcomere is the basic functional unit of a skeletal muscle. Okay. And that's what it is. Now let's take a look at a sarcomere. So we're going to take a peek at that. And we're going to just look, from here to here. The sarcomere is made up of boundaries here. Something like this. Okay. Got to try to make it line up. Okay, so these are these borders here of a sarcomere, and we see that it's not actually straight. It's got this little zigzaggy pattern to it. These boundaries are called Z discs or Z lines, depending on what your textbook is. All right, so the boundaries of the sarcomere are these Z discs. In the middle, we have kind of suspended by proteins to the Z disc this structure here in the middle. And we have these repeated like this. Okay. And within each one of these, or part of it, they have these little structures that stick out like this. Okay, so I hope you're drawing this or attempting to draw it. All right, and again, these are suspended or anchored. Think of these as little anchors. All right, now because it's so thick, we call this the thick filament or thick myofilament. And we'll talk about what that is made up of. Now, interspersed amongst here, there are also structures called thin filaments. Okay, the thin filaments are located interspersed amongst that. Okay, so these are the thin filaments or thin myofilaments. All right. Now let's take a look at the thin and thick filament. And then, realize that it continues on, right? Here's the next sarcomere over. Here's another sarcomere going this way, etc. So it continues over and over and over again, right, etc. And we repeat the sarcomeres over and over. Okay, so let's take a look. The thick filament is made up of a protein. The protein is called myosin. Myosin protein molecules. So if we look at a single myosin, it looks like this. Okay, so this is a myosin molecule. And we form the thick filament by putting together a whole bunch of myosin molecules. And so they have this little section, a little projection here called the myosin head. All right, so we have a whole bunch of myosin molecules like this. That's what these little things sticking out are the myosin heads. And then we have some that go this way. All right. All right, and so that's why there's a lot of them, so it makes it really thick. Okay, and so this is the thick filament made up of a whole bunch of individual myosin molecules. Let's take a look at the thin filament. It's a little more complex, even though it's smaller. Okay, this is made up of 3 different proteins. Okay, 3 different proteins. The first one is let's see, let's call it A. It's called actin. It's an actin molecule. Okay, I'm going to denote it by like a little circle, like that. The second one is called troponin molecule. And I'm going to kind of draw it like that. And then the third protein is called the tropomyosin molecule. Okay, so the tropomyosin molecule, it's more like a rope. Oh, I should have made it. Okay, so it's like a rope. Now let's put them together. So the thin filament is made up of actually a whole bunch of actin molecules. Like this. I'll show you a better picture. But again, it's good to draw it. So these are the actin molecules. We have the troponin kind of interspersed. Inside here. And then we have the tropomyosin kind of amongst that, like this. Now, in the actin, there is an area that is a site for binding of the myosin heads. So I'm going to call this a binding site. Okay, this little area for myosin heads. And so when muscle contraction is not happening, the binding sites are covered by the tropomyosin, like that. Okay, so see, the rope, the tropomyosin, covers up the binding site. And then what we're going to see is that, so this is the troponin, and this is the tropomyosin. we're going to see what happens when we contract our muscles, right? So how do these parts all fit together so that we can contract a muscle and, move around and things like that? All right, so let's go back now. Take a peek at our. Okay, and I'm going to bring up a picture. Several pictures here, actually. So it says draw a simple one. You could actually, do a screenshot of my drawing and put it in here if you want, or use, the one in the textbook, which is this. I want to make it fit. Okay. Well, I'm going to make it big so we can look at it. All right, so here, whole muscle, fascicles, muscle fiber, myofibrils. So here we're drawing a muscle fiber, and these are the individual myofibrils. Okay. We'll take a closer look because there's other structures in here, and maybe I should have drawn it in here. But this is just endoplasmic reticulum, okay, of a muscle. So we call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now let's take another view. Okay, so here again, we have our myofibril coming out of our muscle fiber. We can see it's got a stripe pattern, and it's because of the orientation of the proteins. Okay, this is what it looks like in the microscope. It has patterns of dark and light because there's thick filaments that appear darker and thin filaments that appear lighter. So we're looking at a single sarcomere here, and we can see the thick filaments in green and then the thin filaments on either side of that. Okay, so here's the thick filament here made up of all the myosin molecules. And then we have the thin filament made up of the three parts, the actin, the troponin, and tropomyosin. Okay, and this is going to be really important to understand this anatomy, because when we talk about the physiology and how does contraction work, then we have to put this all together. All right. Now, before we do that and actually talk about muscle contraction, there's one more thing I want to draw, which is something called the neuromuscular junction. So because we have to tell our muscles, our skeletal muscles, to contract, how do we do that? We do that by sending nerve impulses, sending, electrical impulses along nerves that go to the muscle. Okay, so if I tell you to raise your hand, okay, like this, you heard me, okay, you maybe even saw my hand rise, and then your brain will send electrical messages to the muscles in your hand, in your arm, okay, and cause you to contract those muscles. Right. So I kind of want you to, try to wrap your head around, what we're going to do. We're going to look at, number one, that area, the junction between the nerve and the muscle. Okay, so what is happening there? And then we're going to look at what happens in the muscle and all these anatomical structures and how they work. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the neuromuscular junction. Again, a junction is where things come together. Okay, so let's draw the neuromuscular junction next. Okay, so we're going to go back to our drawing. And draw the neuromuscular junction. Oops, wrong way, sorry. I want to zoom out. Okay, so this is question number 17. So we have to have a nerve first, and I'm going to call it a motor neuron. So a neuron is a nerve cell, right? Neuron is a nerve cell. And we haven't really learned a lot about the nervous system and neurons, but just kind of take my word for it. We're going to get into what is a neuron and et cetera. So we have a nerve coming down and a nerve cell like this. Okay. So I'm going to call this the motor neuron. Okay, the nerve cell. And then the muscle surface is here. Okay, so this is the neuromuscular junction. Let's label some things in here. Within the motor neuron, right at the end, there are vesicles here. We call those synaptic vesicles. Inside the synaptic vesicles, we have chemicals. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters. Now, there are lots of different neurotransmitters. That allow us to communicate between neurons and other structures. It could be another neuron, it could be a muscle, it could be something else, but we have these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Now, in the neuromuscular junction, that neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. It's just the particular neurotransmitter found in this one area in the neuromuscular junction. So acetylcholine. Okay. Again, there's lots of different types of neurotransmitters, but here is acetylcholine. All right. Now we have this space here. This space here is called the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft is just this, there's a little space between the neuron and the muscle surface. This muscle surface is called a motor end plate. All right, so it's got a little bit of a wavy surface to it. The motor end plate, that's just the way it is. There's the, a little area here where the neuron will, interact there. Okay, so motor end plate. Now within the motor end plate, we have receptors here that are very specific to that particular neurotransmitter. So this is called acetylcholine receptor. All right, I hope you're kind of getting a vision of what's going to happen. How do we get information from a nerve or neuron, okay, to the muscle? All right, and then this would be the muscle surface called this is the cell membrane or the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber or the muscle fiber. So we'll call it the sarcolemma, and I should have called that. The sarcolemma is the membrane of the muscle surface. Okay. Now, this is the neuromuscular junction right here. But I'm going to continue a drawing here, and we're going to look at other structures within the muscle cell or muscle fiber. Okay. There are areas in the muscle fiber where it dips down into these pathways that lead to the inside structures. And within here, we have, organelles, because it is a cell. the endoplasmic reticulum of a muscle cell. So the endoplasmic reticulum is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, just because sarco means muscle, and it's an endoplasmic reticulum of the muscle. So SR is sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, within the sarcoplasmic reticulum, we have another chemical. This is calcium. Calcium ions. See, little a, sorry. So these are calcium ions. 2+ just means that it lost 2 electrons, okay? I'm not going to worry too much about it. But just calcium is stored within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. All right. And then, inside here, we have our sarcomeres, our thin and thick filaments, right? All our myofibrils are inside here. And so, this is inside the muscle fiber, the muscle cell. All right. So we have to know our parts in order to talk about muscle contraction, because now that's the next thing we're going to do. Maybe let's go back and I'm going to show you, put a nice picture. Okay, let's go back to okay, and I'm going to put a nice picture here. Let's see, did we list everything? Motor neuron, motor end plate, synaptic cleft, synaptic vesicles, neurotransmitter, right? And then in particular, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So you do have to know that. All right, so here's this neuron, end of the nerve cell. Here, synaptic cleft, here's the motor end plate, and then here are the acetylcholine receptors. Okay? All right, I think that's good for that. Now, question number 18. Describe the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. All right, so looking at your pictures, okay, I'm going to first, okay, I'm going to put a link here. See the muscle contraction sheet. Now, I think this is linked here, but also you can go into the ungraded resources, lecture resources, and find this sheet. And what it does is it outlines the steps to muscle contraction. And in fact, maybe I'll put them here. I'll go ahead and list the 10 steps for muscle contraction. Let me see this one. So steps to muscle contraction. And there are 10. Okay. Let's see, oh, I'm gonna make it. Okay, so these are the 10 steps. And okay, there they are. And you can condense this a little. Let's see if that'll work. Okay, it does. Save some space here. You can make it look however you want. It's your study guide. Okay, so follow along with your picture, or maybe I'll go back to my picture. And while you're looking at this, no, I don't think I can do that. Okay, so let's just use this picture while we're here. So the electrical impulse will travel down the motor neuron. Once it hits the end, it's going to cause the synaptic vesicles to release their acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine travels across the synaptic cleft and it's going to bind to the acetylcholine receptors. Now, the acetylcholine receptor, by binding, it causes an electrical impulse And again, don't worry too much about what that means. We will do that later. But know that there's a change in the membrane, which is going to be generated and move along the membrane. So the AP means action potential. That is this electrical message that's going to move along the surface of the muscle. Okay, once it moves along the surface, now I will have to go back. Okay, so it travels along the surface and it's going to make its way down this little pathway into the center of the muscle fiber. Okay, now I'm going to have to go back to my picture. So the electrical impulse is going to travel, okay, down this tubule here. This is called a T-tubule or transverse tubule. So it makes its way down here. And once it hits the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it's going to cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release the calcium. Calcium is released into the muscle fiber, okay, and interact with the myofibrils. Okay, now the myofibrils, okay, so the myofibrils contain thick filament, thin filament, right? And attached to the Z lines. Okay, so the calcium is actually going to bind to the troponin. So it binds to the troponin of the thin filament. Okay, remember we have our actin here. And then we have the tropomyosin. All right, so the calcium is going to come and bind to the troponin. When it binds to the troponin, it causes the tropomyosin to move. Okay, so it's something called the conformational change. Sometimes you bind a molecule and it causes a change in structure. And so the tropomyosin is the little rope thing is going to move and now expose binding sites for myosin heads. So now the myosin heads can bind to the thin filaments. Because when the tropomyosin was covering it, it couldn't bind. All right, but now the myosin heads are going to bind. After the myosin heads bind, if you have ATP present, what it's going to do is going to cause the myosin heads to swivel. Okay, in other words, if this was the myosin head like this, it's going to do this. Again, a little change in structure, and all the myosin heads are going to go this. Okay, but because it's attached to the actin, it's actually going to pull the thin filaments and move them closer together because we have myosin heads here. Okay, so let's say this is a myosin head. Here's a thin filament. When it swivels, it's going to move the thin filament. All right, but it's doing it on both sides like this. Okay, it's going to pull it like this. So the thin filaments that are like this are going to move closer together toward the center of the sarcomere. Okay, because again, it's happening on both sides. Now, once the myosin heads swivel, if you have ATP present, it actually will allow it to detach, recock, reattach, and swivel again. All right. So as long as you have energy, ATP present, it does this. Okay. So the myosin heads, but we don't have just two myosin heads. We have a whole bunch that are now attaching, swiveling, detaching, recocking, attaching. And so we have all these myosin heads that are doing this and moving the thin filament in toward the center. Okay. And what happens then? So now let's go back. All right, and take a peek back here. So now when we look at the setup of, maybe I have to. Okay, So now the myosin heads are pulling on these thin filaments, but it's doing it from both sides, and it's causing the Z discs to move closer together. But when we have a whole bunch of sarcomeres, all the sarcomeres are shortening. And so it causes a shortening of the whole muscle. And when a muscle shortens, it's going to cause movement. Okay, that's what contraction is. It's a shortening of the muscle, but it has to do with these myosin heads, binding, detaching, and, reattaching and pulling it toward. Now, okay, I say raise your hand, but now I say, okay, put your hand down. All right, what happens? Okay, you're sending electrical impulses to stop contraction. So what you're doing is you're going to take the calcium back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Without calcium, then the myosin heads detach. Well, actually, the tropomyosin moves back and causes the myosin heads to detach. ATP is needed for that, right? So the ATP is needed to detach, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then once it detaches, then the thin filaments go back to where they were, and your muscle relaxes. All right. And so contraction is a very complicated, multi-stepped set of procedures, okay, that have to be coordinated. But do we even think about it? I think majority of us don't even think about it, right? I tell you to write this down or draw this, and you send electrical impulses to those muscles to cause you to write that, because you have to tell your muscles to write it. Okay, you have to tell your hand to do that, but there's lots of muscles that have to contract in a very particular order. It's just a little crazy. I'm still, every time I talk about it, I'm like, what is happening? All right, but it's amazing. You're amazing. Okay. All right, so that's what these steps are. Okay. You do need to know the different steps to muscle contraction. And don't try to memorize these steps. More look at the picture and envision how this happens, how information moves along these structures we talked about. And hopefully it will make sense as you look at it that way, right? Instead of the individual steps. All right. The next thing is something called a motor unit. Okay. So a motor unit is, let me give you the definition. It's a motor neuron plus all the muscle fibers it innervates. So what does that mean? So motor unit is a motor neuron plus all the fibers it innervates. Okay, so let me bring up a picture. All right, so here is the motor neuron, okay? But a single motor neuron can go to multiple muscle fibers, okay? And some motor neurons can go to hundreds of muscle fibers. And some motor neurons go to one or two muscle fibers. Okay, so we can have motor units with varying amounts of muscle fibers it controls. All right, so what does this mean? Why is this important? It's to understand how we get like different levels of contraction. All right, so for example, if I want to pick up this pen, okay, or let's say someone's going to put the pen in my hand, okay, I'm going to anticipate how many motor units I need to recruit. Okay, so in my mind, I'm going, that's pretty light. I only need to maybe send electrical impulses to one neuron that goes to a few muscle fibers. Okay, boom. So I hold my hand out, you put it in my hand, and look at, I can hold it. Right? Now, if I put a cup in my hand, I know that's going to be a little heavier. So I'm going to recruit more motor units. And I'm using the same muscles, but I'm not going to use the entire muscle. I'm just going to recruit the amount of muscle fibers I need. So maybe I'm going to recruit a couple motor units, right? And so when I put it in my hand now, I can hold it in place because I've already anticipated how many motor units I'm going to need. Now, what if I put a giant rock? Okay, someone puts a giant rock in my hand. I'm going to, let's say, recruit all the muscle fibers, all the motor units in that muscle to be able to hold it and maintain it in that position. But what if that giant rock was made out of styrofoam? And I didn't know that. Okay, and someone puts the rock in my hand and I'm ready. And they drop it in my hand. What am I going to do? I'm going to go, whoa, okay, because I recruited too many muscle fibers, too many motor units, and I overcompensated and I contracted all my muscles. Or what if someone put this pen in my hand, but it was made up of something super heavy? They're going to put it in my hand and I'm going to lower my hand because I didn't recruit enough motor units to hold it in place. All right, see, so we can anticipate how many motor units we're going to need to recruit to do a particular, action, which is kind of amazing that we do that. All right. This one, question number 20, is looking at muscle fibers. Okay, so now, up until now, I've been just calling these muscle fibers, right? Each one is a muscle fiber made up of a whole bunch of myofibrils in it. But now I'm going to tell you that not all muscle fibers are the same. They vary in their characteristics. And so there's a several different types of muscle fibers. Okay, so here they are. There are slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. Slow twitch fibers look different. They are red in color, and they're red fibers because they have a higher pigment called myoglobin. And myoglobin is a pigment that binds to oxygen. So, they also have more blood supply. So that's what makes them red also. They contract very slowly and they resist fatigue, meaning they can contract slowly for a very long time. Okay. They have a lot of mitochondria. We know more mitochondria means more ATP, right? More cellular respiration, and we can make more energy. Okay. So again, resist fatigue, meaning we can contract them for a longer period of time. So who would have them? Marathon runners. Okay, someone who does endurance sports. Okay, it doesn't just have to be marathon. It could be, swimming long distances or biking long distances. So these are endurance sports, right? Because you're able to make a lot of ATP and you have a lot of blood supply, so a lot of oxygen could go to those muscles. The other one are fast twitch fibers. They contract very quickly, but they fatigue very quickly because you don't have as much myoglobin. You don't have as much blood supply there, capillaries in there, which carry oxygen, less mitochondria. They appear white in color because you don't have the myoglobin in the blood supply. All right, so they're white. Weightlifters, which require a lot of force, but can't be sustained over a long period of time, right? People who lift heavy weights, they're not going to hold that for an hour. Okay, they're going to lift it once and then drop it. So they contract very quickly, but they get tired fast because you're not able to make as much ATP, right? Less mitochondria. So I like to think of a turkey or a chicken, right? A turkey who walks, what do? They walk all day. All right, their legs, their thighs, okay, would be red fibers. That's the dark meat. Okay. The breast, which isn't used, they don't fly, okay? They don't use their breast muscles to flap their wings because they don't fly. So those are white in color. Okay, less mitochondria, okay, not as much cellular respiration occurs there. But if a coyote comes into the pen, okay, they're going to use their wings, flap quickly, but they're going to tire out. They can't fly away. All right, so that's the white meat. Okay, so next time you look more closely at your thighs and the breasts of the turkey or chicken. Okay, so weightlifter, sprinter. Okay, sprinter versus a marathon runner would have different proportions of these different fibers. So this is a genetic thing. So some people are born with more fast twitch fibers, and so they're going to be, better at running fast and things like that. And then marathon runners have a higher percentage of these types of fibers. And a lot of it is genetic, so sorry. But you can train. There are fibers that are intermediate in these characteristics, and they can be trained to be more of one or the other. All right. So training does help, but genetics does play a role. Okay. Last few ones. When we get into muscles, we'll talk about attachment sites for muscles. Okay, because skeletal muscles, again, we're talking about skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones. And so the origin of a muscle is the attachment site that moves the least, because there's going to be an anchor in a muscle. So think of every muscle that you contract, there's going to be an anchor, the side that doesn't move, and it tends to be more proximal. In other words, it's closer to the body, okay? Insertion is the other attachment site, and that's the part that moves. So it tends to be more distal or farther away from the body. So when you contract muscles, all right, the anchor is called the origin, and the insertion is called the part that moves is the insertion. So here's an example. You're going to learn a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. This muscle is named for its origins and insertions. Okay, all the attachment sites. So what do you think that muscle is attached to? Sternocleidomastoid. The sternum, here, the breastbone, okay? The clavicle, cleido, here's the clavicle. And then the mastoid process, which is the bony feature here, okay? It's this muscle. See this big muscle that bulges? It's attached, it's got an origin in the sternum and the clavicle. And then it's got a single insertion and the mastoid process, which is the bump behind your ear. Okay? All right. So, not all muscles are named for its origin insertion, okay? But some of them are. And you're going to learn the name of a lot of different muscles, and muscles are named for many different reasons. Some are named for its location, some are named for its size, its shape. All right, so there's lots of reasons, and then also for its action, like what does it do when it contracts? How does it move the body? So you're going to look here when it gets to the end at the muscle list and learn the names, learn the location, and be able to identify all these different muscles from a diagram. All right. Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So what is it? What causes it? And what are symptoms? Okay. Here. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy, first of all, is a genetic disease. Okay? And it's a problem with a gene on the X chromosome. So it is linked to sex, as far as, on the X chromosome, which is a sex chromosome. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what that means as far as inheritance and things like that, but there's a gene that is defective, and dystrophin is a protein. So there's a gene that makes a protein normally that is important in muscles and attachment of muscles within fibers. So if you're born with this defective gene, you're not able to make this protein, and or it's abnormal, and so the muscle fibers aren't usable, or they begin to be over time less and less, or more and more damaged. Okay, and so as they become damaged, then they're not useful. They don't contract how they're supposed to. So this disease often, slowly, the muscles waste, and these children are then unable to walk, in a wheelchair, and most don't live into their 20s. All right, so it's kind of a devastating disease, as it begins to affect other things such as breathing muscles and things like that. There are gene therapies that are attempting to replace abnormal genes. Like if we can take the DNA and replace the gene, because the technology is getting good at being very precise and being able to replace defective genes. So hopefully that's something for the future. All right, because it's a pretty catastrophic disease. And then, as I mentioned, there's a muscle list. So make sure you take a look at the muscle list, and be able to identify those muscles. And we'll talk about those in another video. Okay, and be sure to see your tutor. Okay, especially with the muscles, the bones. You'll want to visit the tutor, and she will give you ways to learn them, to remember them, and to instead of just memorizing. All right, and then also, that tutor will help you with your study guide or any other concepts that might be confusing. So, okay, and I think we are done. Thanks for watching.